My name is David Natcher, and I'm at the University of Saskatchewan. And I've, like Francis and Brenda, been asked to look over some of the activities of one of the themes involved in that work. And mine is Indigenous communities and social economy. And I have to admit, I came a little bit late into the network, just a little bit. I wasn't really involved in the development of the initial proposal that went ahead and got funding. So when Chris contacted me, and Chris Southcott, the PI on the project, contacted me and asked if I'd want to be involved, my first reaction was, yeah, sounds really interesting, but what in the world is the social economy? Because at least in the 20 or so years that I've worked and lived in northern communities, I never heard the term referenced. At least from working from Alaska to Labrador, it wasn't a concept that I was at all familiar with. And I learned quickly it really wasn't a concept that was really too familiar with the communities I worked with either. So after getting involved, and I was at Memorial University at the time, I spent a lot of time up on the Labrador coast, and we discussed what does the social economy mean. And some of the more traditional definitions were discussed, and I think we ultimately came to a decision was, well, let's not get hung up on labels. It's not terribly important to what we want to do here. But the definition that we really arrived at was it's those economic activities in communities that have equally important social dimensions attached to it. So how communities function. What are those special human dimensions or social dimensions that make economic production valuable or important in communities? And it may have been influenced by my own research interest, but the areas that we kind of arrived at, and you could switch, are, at least in the Aboriginal communities that I work with, it's around these areas. Wildlife harvesting, wage labor, sharing and reciprocity, and the regulatory regimes that all influence those activities. So that's how we, in the work that we did under this theme, conceptualized the social economy. We look at these different dimensions and how they influence each other and how they're nested within the social economy of Indigenous communities. So based on this approach, we went out and developed a research plan around those dimensions. And it seemed like the communities that became involved were quite comfortable going this way. I suspect there's any number of other directions we could have gone, but this is the areas that we really focused on. So over the course of the past 5 years, we've funded a number of projects from Alaska to Labrador, and I'll highlight a couple today. But just a couple under the Indigenous communities and the social economy theme. We have a project looking at hunter support programs and sustaining locally based livelihoods in the north. And this is looking at the relationship between different programs to facilitate access to the land. What are those programs, those gas subsidy programs that are available in certain regions? What are the institutionalized ways to get people to participate in the, quote, informal economy or the wildlife harvesting? So what's the relationship between the two? Different sowing programs that are available for the production of crafts. So we have a graduate student working at Memorial University doing an inventory of these different programs, then doing an analysis on how actually they contribute to the local economies. Another one is examining northern social economy through the lens of natural resource management. And again, this is actually the wife of the graduate student from the first project, Carolina Titleman, who's also doing her doctoral research there. And she's looking at the role of natural resource management regimes, particularly in how it influences the social economy. Given the prevalence and influence that northern co-management boards have on how communities function and the priorities that are set, looking at those organizations through a social economy lens. And one of the aspects that I'll highlight in a couple slides from now, and actually it really arose from the first workshop that we had here a few years ago, was the role of women on northern co-management boards. And I'll just show you some of the numbers that Carolina has come up with. and the very limited number of women who are involved in wildlife management boards across the country. And maybe I'll just mention some of the potential implications of that lack of representation. Food security and the cross-border dimensions of the Vuntut-Quechin social economy. This was a project that was requested by Vuntut-Quechin to look at how food sharing has been influenced, particularly since 9/11, with communities in Alaska, and how the increased enforcement of that border has really led to the severing of social relationships between the Vuntut-Quechin and communities on the Alaska side, as well as communities in the NWT. The bureaucracy that's now attached to simply sharing food between family members. So I have a graduate student, Toby Jeans, who's been involved in that, and she was supposed to be here, but as sometimes happens, she went into the field and she fell in love, and she's actually getting married this week. So that's a pretty good excuse. So she's in Arizona marrying someone from Fort Yukon. So. Subsistence and the social economy of Nunatsiavut. This was a project that was done in collaboration with the Nunatsiavut government to look at wildlife harvesting in the NG communities. And not only wildlife harvesting, but food sharing, barriers to harvesting, time allocation, how much time men and women allocate to wildlife harvesting, wage labor, and some of the social characteristics attached to sharing wild foods between kin, non-kin relationships. Some of the projects that have already been mentioned, but these, it's hard to compartmentalize all these projects. There's important overlaps between all of them. So the impact of participation in the wage economy on traditional harvesting, dietary patterns and social networks in the Bialot settlement region, history of mixed economy and policy initiatives. So what we hope to do is bring all this research together and have something very informed from all these case studies that happen across the country. Okay. So here's some of those numbers. I'll just throw up some tentative results of some of the projects that we've come up with. And Carolina was able to put these slides together. And this is just Yukon membership, looking at the Yukon Fish and Wildlife Management Board, as well as the Renewable Resource Councils that are functioning within each settled land claims area. And you can see the representation is pretty low for Aboriginal women in particular, and even for non-Aboriginal or government-appointed members. And some of the boards across the country, and again, some of the Yukon Fish and Wildlife Management Board, Nunavut Wildlife Management Board, and NWT Wildlife Management Advisory Committee. The numbers are pretty striking. And when you compare this internationally with other countries, Pakistan, India, where female representation is considerably higher than what we're seeing here in Canada, it raised certain questions about the role of women in natural resource management. Now, we find there's obvious barriers. Oftentimes, women in northern communities have many other roles that they're performing, along with domestic responsibilities, and they simply don't have the time to participate in some of these additional boards. But we also, in some of our interviews, came across some pretty strong statements about the appropriate role of women on some of these organizations, and it was actually, in some cases, pretty striking. Like, this is an interview, and some of the things that men actually said, and so there's certain biases that are at play here, at least in wildlife management boards, and the work that Carolina's doing through her dissertation and some of the reports that we'll be producing. What are some of the implications? How do priorities get set about future economic development plans if it's a male-dominated perspective? So, I think with the reports we're going to produce, we just want to, keep this in mind. This is a significant issue, and in other places where gender equity is a requirement in wildlife management, say in India, for community forest management boards, you don't see that in Canada. And I think that could be a very significant issue as things change so rapidly in the north. So, this is some of the work we did in Nunatsiavut, just looking at the household harvesting and participation rates. And you can see harvesting is still a really important economic activity in the communities. they're spending a considerable amount of time on the land harvesting wild foods. Time allocation models between wage earning and wildlife production. Now this isn't, I put 29.35 weeks per year. This is not devoted specifically to wage earning. This is the number of weeks that men or women participated in wage earning opportunities. So you can just see the amount of time in wild food production that male participate in the harvesting of wild foods on average 47 weeks out of the year. So it's an important economic activity and social activity in those communities, as well as female participation. This is also coming out of the Natcher project, and this is just to kind of coupled with that time allocation. Once the harvesting is done, once people go out and secure seals and caribou, what then happens? And we find that at least 96% of all households in New Natcher, of the 876 households in New Natcher, are involved in food exchange. And actually, in Postville, for example, there were only 4 households that were not involved in food sharing, and those were 4 brand new teachers to the community. And they simply just hadn't established any social networks and were brand new to the community. But you can see, I just put a couple examples, and the table's not very good, I apologize. But these are just 4 household networks that cooperate in the community of Postville. And you can see in that left-hand corner, it's a relatively simple network involving that circle there in the middle. It's an elder couple. And the households around it are developing households, single mother households, and a mature household. And there's a little dashed line that comes in, and that's from a son who's working in Makovic, who is also sending food down to his family. So going from that relatively simple network, you have that one on the bottom involving, I want to say 23 households, or 18 households, but a relatively complex sharing network that shares food, wages, and labor, all collectively pooled into a livelihood strategy for these households. So they're pooling resources, they're pooling labor, and they cooperate as a unit. And again, you can see the dashed lines or arrows going in and out of those networks. So there's a lot of food also moving up and down the coast that also contribute to that, how that network functions. And again, right in the middle of that complex network are 2 elders, the grandparents' households, who serve as the kind of nucleus of those networks. This is that very first simple network, and all this is it's overly complicated. It was used in a paper that was written a while back, but this just shows the mix between wage labor and wildlife harvesting. So there's people involved in full-time labor, people involved in part-time labor, that occasional opportunities that come up, and also the wildlife harvesting. And again, it's the opportunity to pool all those resources into one unit that functions together. Jumping to the west, this is Old Crow, and again I mentioned that project that Toby Jeans and I and Norma Cassie and the Arctic Health Research Network in the Yukon have been involved in for the past couple of years, and looking at food exchange between Gwich'in communities, and also how food is exchanged in Old Crow. And this is just a real simple little diagram to show how food is exchanged and how food is given from the communities in Alaska to Old Crow. You'll probably see far more sophisticated diagrams tomorrow in Roger's analysis maybe, but he's doing really similar work and really important work, and we're seeing a lot of commonalities between what the work that Roger and Brenda are doing and the work that Toby and Vuntuk Gwich'in are doing. Again, and here's food that's leaving Old Crow to other communities. Now, looking at this diagram, it looks like, okay, there's might be a decent amount of food that's crossing the border, and that's actually not the case. We find that about 1,400 pounds, predominantly caribou, was sent over to Old Crow, and a little bit to Chalkitsik. The border, and particularly since 9/11, has become a real obstacle to Old Crow being able to share, one, caribou, but also to get salmon. And it's having a huge impact on Old Crow. And it's not that they're not allowed to cross the border with food, but the amount of bureaucracy now that's attached to taking food either by plane or boat to the other communities is serving as a huge obstacle. The amount of paperwork that's involved, as well as into the NWT. The amount of paperwork to do it legally is serving as an obstacle. And we interviewed an elder from Old Crow, and he was talking about his daughter who's down at Fairbanks going to school at University of Alaska Fairbanks, and how he wanted to just send some whitefish down to her, and how it got sent back. The airline wouldn't take it down, and this elder tearing up because he couldn't share some whitefish, and that connection was being severed between himself and his granddaughter. I mean, just a little bit of food that connects her to Old Crow. And because of the enormous paperwork that was involved and the forms, I mean, it really, the forms in triplicate, just to make a connection to a granddaughter, it was significant. So there's the social aspect, but there's also the food security aspect, where these communities have always shared food in times of need. Not long ago, Old Crow, or Arctic Village, came up, chartered a plane. They were invited by Old Crow, harvested caribou, flew back. They were able to get through the winter. That's just not happening now because of the enforcement of the border and the institutionalization of food sharing that now takes place. So. Summary of findings. We're really finding that, despite the changes, and there's been enormous changes, everyone in this room knows, in northern communities, the harvesting of wild food and the sharing of wild food is still very prevalent in at least all the communities we work with. We're in the midst, Charles is here from Makivik, we're in the midst of starting a new project in Nunavik that is using the same methodology as New Natcher. So we have New Natcher, Makivik, some communities in Alberta, Old Crow, and Alaska, all using the same food sharing survey and food harvesting survey. And we can say, we haven't started the Makivik work, but food sharing and food harvesting is still, widely practiced. It's changing though. There's always been this model, it's the 30-70 rule, where you have about 30% of the community harvesting about 70% of all the wild foods in the community. And it's a pretty standard model across the north. We're now seeing it's more like the 20-80 model, where you have fewer households harvesting a lot of food for others. And we're seeing that across the north. And then again, it goes back to the importance then of food sharing and food distribution. Yeah, I'll just go to the next one. So some of the policy implications, and we've been spending a lot of time traveling. I'm heading up to Alaska in a couple weeks to share these results and talk about some of the policy implications and what can be done. We've been doing a lot of community reporting and thinking about what the next steps are in terms of policy formation. And certainly any attempt to develop more effective northern policy has to begin to appreciate and truly appreciate the complexity of these northern indigenous economies. They vary from year to year. 1 year, Postville and Labrador might harvest a huge amount of food. And a lot of people might be on the land. The next year, exploration activity might be soaring, where you have a lot of young guys out working in wage labor. So they're very flexible and they're dynamic. So there's no one subsistence economy, but northern policy has to appreciate the dynamic and complex nature of local economies. Subsistence and wage earning activities are intrinsically linked and form a vital component of the northern social economy, and more appropriate policies promoting equitable linkages between the two are certainly required. So that's, I think that's the last slide, and now we're going back, and we have a workshop scheduled in Old Crow with a lot of the regulatory agencies. Department of Homeland Security is coming in, and we're going to try to find ways that facilitate ease of access for the Gwich'in across the border. So I think that's a positive step that a lot of the agencies, federal, state, and territorial, are willing to come together and talk about how the border movement can be improved. So hopefully something very positive will come out of that workshop. So thanks.